fill her up and fill us all up to hear the truth of what she's got to say. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, hello? Okay, good. Let me just set up my notes. Hello. I'm Nicki, as they've said. Some of you guys might know me. Some of you, I preached a sermon, I think now 2 summers ago. I moved here with my husband and our daughter Odessa back in 2021, and we've since had our son Leland in 2022, so he'll be 2 in September. But yeah, I'm American, if you couldn't tell. Some people guess Canadian, which I'll happily take, but no. And yeah, we're doing, if you have or haven't been here, we've been doing a series on the monastic tradition. And I meant to get my timer going, so I stay on time. Just what are some ancient traditions we can really take from them and bring into our modern life? So something that we talked about is how that movement kind of started. There was the Roman Empire, and Christianity was, an oppressed religion at the time, and then Constantine decided to kind of bring that into the mainstream, and the Desert Fathers and Mothers were like, whoa, this is not who Jesus was. He wasn't about power, he wasn't about empire, and we can't be a part of that. And so they sort of just opted out. And I think already that kind of shows this heart that they had, or a finger on justice. So CCE has a few purposes. I think we have these up on a slide. Okay, so to be a Christ-centered community, to see people fully alive, and to help the world flourish. So I don't think you can really, achieve the last 2 without the first one, but today I'm going to be focusing on how we might be able to participate in the last 2 specifically. So I want to focus on the monastic movement's practice of justice, specifically how some of their disciplines led to an awareness of injustice and made them active participants in building the kingdom. My hope is that as a church, we would grow in this awareness of the needs of our community and our wider society, stepping into a co-creative role of building the kingdom and helping people be fully alive and helping the world flourish. So I just want to read Isaiah 1:17. Up on the screen, so you can read it as well. It says, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow." So in my research for this sermon, which is fun for me, I liked learning and just discovering a little bit more. I'll talk about this some later, but my education was really focused on the Christian tradition and worldview. But as Rupert said in one of the earlier sermons, unfortunately, it was very focused only on the European Renaissance and Reformation. So when Rupert said, I think we tend to think that church history started in the Reformation, I was like, oh yeah, what was even happening in the Eastern Church? And so that was something I looked into, and I came across St. Basil. I know you guys would probably say that, Basil. And he's really cool. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things he was excited about or propelled in one of my first points, but we owe a lot to him. He supported the Nicene Creed. He is seen as the father of communal monasticism in the Eastern Church, and he did a lot of work combating heresies that specifically didn't see the Son and the Holy Spirit as full members of the Trinity. And he specifically advocated for, no, the Holy Spirit is a full member of the Trinity. So I think that's really important, something we kind of take for granted today. And his work really inspired St. Benedict, who we've talked about a few times. He wrote the Rule of St. Benedict in 530 AD. And a lot of my research for this, I was looking at Joan Chittister's The Monastic Heart, which I really loved and highly recommend, and she's a Benedictine nun. So a lot of these practices maybe are a little bit more focused on the Benedictine tradition, but I think that they flow with the Basilian as well. So I just want to read this quote by Laura Swan. She's also from the Order of St. Benedict. She says, "Benedict reminds us that any person who yearns to draw close to God will act with justice. This includes both deeds of justice as well as a healthy relationship with others. Doing justice, especially when there's a price to be paid, opens the heart to hear the voice of the Holy One. The cost of injustice may mean attending to our attachments, prejudice, self-will, or self-centeredness. For North Americans, this cost is often economic as we redistribute wealth for those in need. Just choices and actions literally move us towards the Holy One." So she's speaking to an American audience, but I think this is still really poignant. Something she points out is that acting with justice can bring us closer to God's heart, but it will cost us something. And she points out that the cost for Americans might be economic, and I think we have some of that here. But I think largely in our context, the cost for us is going to be comfort. I'm going to read this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. So in America, the month of February is Black History Month. I don't know if you guys have it as a different month here, but I was coming across a lot of different teachings by civil rights activists, and I thought this was really just impactful, what MLK said. He said, "A church that has lost its voice for justice is a church that has lost its relevance in the world." And I think in a post-Christian society, this is what we really stand to lose. We have to get comfortable and step into hard conversations, making ourselves vulnerable enough to listen and speak up when others aren't being heard. So I'm going to kind of talk about 3 different monastic practices that I think will help us grow our awareness for justice. And I think of these 3 things kind of like threads, and then woven together, they'll make a stronger, holistic view of justice. So the first one I want to talk about is stewardship, or there's stewardship, hospitality, and service. I think we have, okay. And then I'm kind of equating these to more modern ideas or secular ideas of justice. We have, for stewardship, climate justice; for hospitality, social and racial justice; and for service, activism. So the first area I want to look at is stewardship. Joan Chittister says, "The Benedictine life is a life of stewardship, of caretaking. It's about having what is necessary to sustain ourselves with decency and dignity, as all people deserve, but it is not dedicated to the amassing of goods." So here we see ideas of caretaking, responsibility, taking only what we need and nothing else, and not amassing wealth. And this is something that St. Basil was really, the last 2, he was really keen on, I guess. He gave up his wealth like most monks, but he built a compound, for lack of a better word, on his estate that I believe is called the Basiliad. And essentially it worked as a hospice, as a house for the poor, as a hospital. And in times of famine, he opened a soup kitchen. And I just think that's a really beautiful picture of these social services that now we see maybe our government taking on, that the monastic tradition took on, I believe, first, and maybe our governments even took some inspiration from. Yes, okay. So I also see this reflection of not taking more than we need, specifically in indigenous cultures. In my own context, American indigenous cultures, I've seen just this reverence for realizing that the earth is a living thing, and whatever they take from it needs to be done with respect, or minimally, or needs to be put back, like something needs to be given back to kind of keep that in a healthy ecosystem. I'm going to read Genesis 1:27 through 28. I'm reading out of the Message version because I think that some of the wording is really helpful. So it says, God created human beings. He created them godlike, reflecting God's nature. He created them male and female. He blessed them. Prosper, reproduce, fill the earth, take charge. Be responsible for the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. I went with this Message version because I think, at least in my go-to of the NIV or similar translations, the word is often dominion or subdue rather than responsibility. And I think in a capitalist society, it's just so easy to equate that with control or exploit or sort of do with what you will, rather than this, for me, at least responsibility, I really equate to parenting. It's something that I'm supposed to take care of and help grow and help flourish. So this is just a small idea because I think, climate justice, taking care of the world can be a really big thing. So something I wanted to kind of give to you guys that you can maybe take individually is just practicing some ethical consumer choices. So something I've learned about recently is smartphones. We all have them, and they all require cobalt to function properly. And sadly, cobalt largely is not ethically mined. And so this is causing genocide, displacement, and slavery, specifically in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so something I'm trying to do for myself is, one, make my smartphones last as long as possible so I don't have to replace them. But two is committing to, if I need a new device, to buy refurbished, so at least I'm not contributing to more mining of this currently unethically mined resource, or looking into brands. There's one particular called Fairphone, which they've tried very hard to get all of their materials ethically, and then they've made the phones repairable so you don't have to renew, just buy a new one. And I think that is really, countercultural. I think in our society, we're like, oh, here's the new iPhone, just go get it. And we don't often think about what are the impacts of how we use our money in some of these small everyday ways. So that's just one little practical way. Maybe you could be thinking, raising awareness of like, how does this device that I use every day contribute or not to helping the world flourish? The second kind of thread I want to talk about is hospitality. So Danny preached a sermon on this 2 weeks ago, I believe. She did an amazing job. You should go listen to it if you weren't present. So I'm not going to re-preach her sermon. She's saving me a lot of time, actually. So, but there's just some things that she mentioned that I think really just go so well with a heart of justice that I want to touch on and maybe expand a little bit. So she mentioned this Dutch word, which I'm not going to attempt to say, for hospitality, that she said meant guest and freedom. And then from that, she said that good hospitality sets others free. And I think that was really, that really struck me. She talked about listening and how when we truly listen to people, when we truly let them feel heard, they start to feel accepted. And she talked about how everyone's to be received as if they are Christ. So this idea of good hospitality sets others free. I came across this quote again by a civil rights activist, and it really convicted me. I think we have it up on the slide. It's actually not that one, but it's by a man named Kwame Ture. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. He says, "There's a difference between peace and liberation, is there not? You can have injustice and have peace. So peace isn't the answer. Liberation is the answer. That's the white man's word, peace. Liberation is our word." And I think in the expanded interview that this quote is in, he talks about how slavery existed in a time of quote unquote peace. So I was just thinking about this in some of my own conversations with my other Christian friends who, in talking about some hard things that are happening in the world, I hear them say, "Oh, I'm praying for peace, I'm praying for peace." And I wonder what that means fully. I think, I've been guilty of this myself, that when I'm praying for peace, I think, especially in messy situations caused by colonialism, I think I'm often praying for a return to my normal, to a return to my comfort, at the expense of setting others free. So I just wonder what this idea of setting others free looks like for those the church has historically excluded, oppressed, or told that they need to change before entering this community of Christ. Danny talked about how we have to listen to each other for good hospitality to happen. She mentioned how that some in this community may even feel that they have to change a part of themselves to get to be here. And this is something that I feel has been a part of my experience slightly. As an American, I feel like I might always be oversharing a little bit. I'm introverted, so I always feel like I have to project more of an extroverted personality. And I've also felt that there's unspoken rules in British society that I don't often catch on to naturally, or sometimes even spoken. And I feel like one of those rules that I've seen permeate even here is that we don't talk about politics, not in this place. I think the sad reality of that is that some people's very existence is political, whether they like it or not, whether we like it or not. And I wonder if we can truly create a Christ-centered community if we're supposed to leave parts of ourselves at the door, if we're not truly free. So I just have these questions up on a slide of what does it look like to set others free, especially for groups the church has historically excluded, oppressed, or hurt? And how do we do Christ-centered community if we aren't being vulnerable enough to share and making ourselves vulnerable enough to truly hear? The last little section I'm going to talk about is service, which I've kind of equated to activism. And so for this, and also I think it ties into hospitality as well, I'm going to look at the Good Samaritan. So if you aren't familiar with the Good Samaritan, I'm not going to read it all out just for the sake of time, but essentially a religious leader, I believe, is trying to catch Jesus and trip him up. And so he says, well, who's my neighbor? How do I love my neighbor? And so Jesus tells this parable. And he tells this story of a man who's walking along the road and gets beaten and left for dead. And then two different people pass him by. One is a Jewish leader, and one is a rabbi. And neither of them help this man. And then lastly comes a Samaritan. And the Samaritan picks him up and puts him on his donkey, takes him to an inn, dresses his wounds, clothes him, and gives the innkeeper money to continue caring for him. And Jesus says, well, who is the neighbor to the beaten man? To which the religious leader says, the one who had mercy on him. And he says, you've answered correctly. Let's just see where my notes are. Okay. I think this is a really beautiful picture of being the hands and feet of Jesus, the Good Samaritan. And I think we see a lot of principles in the monastic tradition that really emulate the Good Samaritan. Joan Chittister again says that Benedict's concern in chapter 35 is that when members serve one another, it makes a bridge from personal needs to social consciousness. Benedicts everywhere for 15 centuries have worked to feed the masses, to save the land, to care for the sick and the poor, to preserve the learnings of humankind, to welcome strangers, to bring beauty to the unsightliness of the world. And I think that's something we really see is this Good Samaritan helping this man and bringing beauty to an unsightly situation. But I think Jesus was doing something else really particular with this story. It would have stung to the audience. The history of the Jewish people is that they were an oppressed people who were pushed out. They were very much the other in Roman society. And yet, even though they experienced this oppression, they then turned around and could place that prejudice and hurt on others, like the Samaritans. This cycle of pain can really continue because oftentimes hurt people end up hurting people. Even myself, as a white Christian, privileged person in Western society, as a woman, I experienced some prejudice and inequality. But that experience of injustice doesn't naturally make me good at spotting it for other people. It doesn't naturally put me in a place of empathy for others or keeping me from continuing a cycle of injustice. I have to continue to place myself in a position of humility and education so that I can always learn to be aware of my blind spots. And I think that this idea of service, it really kind of moves us from awareness into action. I think Joan Chittister talked about oftentimes it brings us to ask, where is God's work not being done, and how can I fill the gap? And I think beyond that, we can ask, how can I take action to help others be fully alive and to help the world flourish? So I mentioned earlier, my education was very Christian growing up. I grew up, if you haven't heard or caught snippets of my story thus far, I grew up in a conservative Christian family in America, was homeschooled, so a lot of my exposure to any kind of differing beliefs outside of my own was strongly discouraged or controlled. I didn't have much awareness of the world outside my own little Christian bubble. So when I got to university, that bubble burst, but more like a dam, kind of slowly leaking and then all at once. I remember meeting queer students in my class and kind of just freezing up like a deer in headlights because I knew we follow Jesus, I'm supposed to love everyone, but all I had been taught in practice was to avoid and judge them. Growing up in American purity culture, I was taught that it was my responsibility to not let men around me stumble with what I wore or how I acted. So I always knew expectations for me were a bit different than for my brothers. But I never felt the full force of this until I stepped into preaching, and my younger brother soon after me, and I was told that that was not my place. I was then made fully aware of this inequality for women that I was just supposed to bow down to submissively. I started to ask questions because that didn't seem to line up with how the Spirit was moving me, and that didn't seem to line up with who I knew Jesus to be. He was someone who set people free, not put more things on top. So I started asking these questions that were dangerous questions, apparently, questions my interpretation of the Bible at the time couldn't handle. Luckily, I had a community, a faith community at the time that allowed me to ask those questions and not feel pushed out, which I know so many people don't have. So now I'm in this community, and again, I have big questions, and I wonder, are they too big or too complicated, too political? I've only been here for a few years, but a climate I am sensing we find ourselves in is that we shy away from explicitly talking about or bringing up hard conversations, especially in the world at large. One example is the conflict in Gaza. I wish I felt safer in this community to share how I've been engaging with the injustice in Palestine. This is something I'm really wrestling with. And even when we bring up other tragedies in the world, the murder of George Floyd, the war in Ukraine, and Afghanistan, it's all touched very gently, as if we're afraid to break something. It's left very clean and sterile, so as not to offend. And this doesn't leave us very vulnerable, but rather protects us, protects our comforts and our sensibilities. And I think it protects us at the expense of defending the oppressed. I wanted to read, it locked on me. This quote by James Baldwin. He says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Justice is so needed, it's so important. It's kingdom building. To be aware of the injustice in our world, we must first listen to those who cry out for help and speak up when they are not heard. Mourn with those who mourn, take on their pain. Loving your neighbor does not allow for them to suffer injustice. Culture has some hard questions and a bleeding heart for issues that I think God really cares about as well. And if we refuse to let this church and this space be a place where people can wrestle with those hard questions, if we remove ourselves from the conversation, we risk what MLK said. We risk becoming irrelevant. We won't achieve our purposes that I listed at the beginning, and I don't believe we'll get to be heard on much else. Proverbs 31:89 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." So I want to thank you guys for listening to me today. I know this is a really heavy, tough topic. We have to look at a lot of our own stuff and move out of our own way. I'm going to leave you guys with one last quote by Joan Chittister because she might be one of my new favorite theologians. And after that, we will open the mic for our Sunday question, as well as I just want to encourage you to use it as a time of reflection. If you don't feel you have an answer to the question, share something that you're wrestling with, something that resonated with you, or something maybe you even disagree with. I think Rupert talks about we need to learn to be a community that still does community even when we disagree. And I don't think we can do that if our disagreements are never spoken. So I'll leave you with this quote. It's a bit long, so there's 2 slides for it actually. But it says, "A world on the brink of marital breakdown, urban violence, international conflict, global deterioration demonstrates without a doubt that spirituality, as usual, has not worked. And no wonder. When traditional spirituality requires the invisibility of half the human race, the spiritual resources of the world go bankrupt. When spirituality means private piety, the public area is left to develop devoid of any kind of values that give heart to the world at large. When spirituality does more to underwrite a system than to challenge it, the system eventually falls under the weight of its own decay. The social signs are clear. Something is missing from spirituality as we have known it because something is missing from life as we've designed it. Thank you.